I want to start this off by trying a little experiment. I want you to close your eyes for a second.
Okay.
Unless you're driving, of course. Please don't close your eyes if you're driving. But if you can, just for a moment, close them.
All right, they're closed.
Now, I want you to picture the suburbs. Just let that image pop into your head.
I'm very curious what you're seeing right now.
Okay, well, personally, I'm seeing a very specific shade of green. You know, that perfectly manicured, almost unnaturally green lawn.
Oh, yeah, the golf course green.
Exactly. Maybe there's a sprinkler going chick chick in the background. I see a winding cul-de-sac where kids are riding bikes, but, you know, not too far.
Right, just in that little loop.
And a 2-car garage. It's quiet. It's safe. It's basically the set of every single American sitcom from, I don't know, Leave It to Beaver all the way up to Modern Family.
That is the dominant cultural image, without a doubt. It's the American dream package. It's what's been sold to us for, what, 80 years now?
At least.
But, and I kind of hate to shatter the illusion right here at the start, if you're clinging to that specific image, you are basically missing the entire story.
The entire story.
Of what is actually happening to our planet, yes.
That feels like a very heavy start for a discussion about lawns and garages.
It sounds dramatic, I know. But the research we're about to dive into today suggests that the whole Desperate Housewives version of the suburbs is a tiny, tiny fraction of the global reality.
So that image in my head is just a mirage.
It's not a mirage, it's just incomplete.
Yeah.
The actual story of suburbanization is so much messier. It's a massive global engine that is, and this is no exaggeration, fundamentally rewriting our economics, our psychology, the environment, and even the very way we interact as human beings.
And that is exactly why we're here today. We have a mountain of research articles, historical deep dives, economic reports, and our whole mission is to deconstruct the sprawl.
We're going to find out that this isn't just about where you sleep at night. This is about a population shift that might be one of the most significant and maybe one of the most overlooked events in human history.
It's really not an exaggeration to say that. We are talking about a total reorganization of how the human species lives. And frankly, we need to move past that white picket fence to even begin to understand the true cost of that reorganization.
Okay, so let's start at the very, very beginning. We throw this word around constantly, suburbanization.
All the time.
I realized while I was prepping for this that I probably use the word suburb 3 or 4 times a week. But if you put a gun to my head, I'm not sure I could give you a perfect dictionary definition. Is it just not the city?
That's how most people define it, really, by the negative. It's not the city and it's not the countryside. It's that in-between space.
The gray area.
Exactly. But technically, suburbanization is a process, not just a place. That's the key distinction.
Like a process. It's defined as a population shift, a movement of people from central urban areas, or sometimes even from rural areas, outward. And what it results in is this low-density peripheral growth.
Peripheral growth?
Yeah.
That sounds like a medical condition.
It sort of behaves like one sometimes, spreading and changing things. But a good way to think about it is like a target.
Okay.
The bullseye is the city center. That's your high density, your skyscrapers, the tight streets. Suburbanization is the ripple effect when you drop a stone in the water. It's the process where the population moves into those outer rings.
That's a great visual. And urban planners have a name for this, right?
You do. It's called the concentric zone model. It's this classic idea that settlement just naturally drives outward from a central point.
So the city is the stone dropped in the pond, and the suburbs are the ripples.
Ideally, yes. In a perfect, neat world, that's how it works. But here is the catch, and this is really where our sources open my eyes.
What's the catch?
That ripple looks totally, completely different depending on where in the world you drop that stone. Meaning, in the U.S., the ripple is that car-centric sprawl we all know, that image you had in your head. But if you go to Eastern Europe or East Asia or the global South, suburbia looks nothing like a cul-de-sac. It's a completely different animal.
I saw that in the notes, and it honestly confused me at first. We're going to be talking about things like chaotic suburbs in Romania and rail-oriented suburbs in Japan. It seems like the only thing they have in common is that they aren't the city center.
They do share one other crucial thing, a fundamental tension, a trade-off.
A trade-off.
No matter where you are in the world, suburbanization always boils down to trading proximity for space.
Okay, break that down.
You are making a conscious or unconscious decision. You're saying, I want more room, I want more affordability, and you are willing to pay for it with distance from the center.
And as we are definitely going to find out, that payment comes with a lot of hidden interest. We're talking about social isolation, massive infrastructure bills that come due decades later, environmental costs,
Exactly. That is the central conflict of the last century of human development. We traded proximity for space, and we are just now, as a society, getting the final bill for that transaction.
Okay, so to understand how we all bought into this trade-off, we have to look at the history. And I think for most of us, especially in the West, we assume this is a post-World War II story, right? The 1950s boom.
That is certainly the big bang of the modern American suburb. You absolutely cannot ignore it. It's the moment it goes from a gradual process to an explosion.
What was the trigger for that explosion?
Well, you had millions of veterans returning home from World War II, an entire generation coming back at once. And you had the GI Bill, which was just this massive government injection of capital into the housing market.
Right, it basically gave veterans access to these incredibly low-interest mortgages. It made buying a house possible.
It made home ownership accessible to a demographic that historically would have been renting for decades. Suddenly, a young family in their 20s could afford to buy a brand new home. But there was a problem.
A housing shortage.
A massive one. There just weren't enough homes in the cities to accommodate this boom.
So they had to build them. And they had to build them fast.
And, most importantly, cheap. You couldn't build cheap, spacious, single-family homes in downtown Manhattan or Chicago. The land was too valuable. You needed cheap land. So developers looked at the vast tracts of farmland on the edge of town and said,
we can pave that.
we can pave that and put up 1,000 identical houses. And they did.
And thus, the Levitowns of the world were born. But I do want to push back a little on this idea that suburbanization just magically started in 1945, because one of the most fascinating parts of the research you sent over was this really deep dive into the history of Brooklyn, New York.
Yes, the Brooklyn case study is absolutely essential. I'm so glad you brought that up. If you want to understand the mechanics of how a city grows, you have to look at Kings County.
Which is so funny because today, if I say Brooklyn, nobody, and I mean nobody thinks suburb. Brooklyn is the city, it's dense, it's urban, it's gritty, it's where you go to pay way too much for coffee and live in a converted loft apartment.
It is now.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But that's the point. Suburbs are not these static statues. They evolve. They have a life cycle. And if you go back to the 18th century, Kings County, which is the landmass of Brooklyn, was just farmland.
Really? It just farmed?
That's it. It was the countryside. Its entire purpose was to grow vegetables for New York City, which at the time was really just the southern tip of Manhattan Island.
So you had Manhattan as this dense, packed urban core, and Brooklyn was just the peripheral resource. It was totally rural.
Completely rural. You would not have recognized it.
Yeah.
But then you have a technological shift, a game changer. The steam ferry arrives.
The iPhone moment of the 19th century.
In a way, yes. I mean, think about it. Before the steam ferry, crossing the East River was a huge hassle. It was weather dependent, it was slow, it was unpredictable. But the steam ferry, that makes the commute reliable.
And the moment you have a reliable commute,
You have the birth of the commuter town.
enter Brooklyn Heights.
Exactly. Brooklyn Heights became the first true suburb for Wall Street. You had these wealthy bankers who worked in the chaos and, frankly, the filth of lower Manhattan.
Right.
But they could take this nice, pleasant ferry ride home to a quiet, tree-lined street in Brooklyn. They had fresh air, they had space, they had a garden.
That sounds incredibly modern. That is essentially the exact same pitch that real estate agents use today. Work in the city, sleep in the quiet.
It's the exact same pitch. The fundamental human psychology hasn't changed in 200 years. But then the technology leveled up again. You get the streetcars.
And the streetcars change the geometry of the entire thing.
They completely change
They
it.
change it.
Right? The ferry only opens up the land that's right next to the water. The streetcar allows you to penetrate miles inland from the ferry terminal. Suddenly, the city of Brooklyn starts to sprawl. It just keeps pushing outward, following those streetcar lines until it fills up the entire county.
And as more and more people moved in, businesses must have followed. It couldn't just be houses forever.
Precisely. This is the critical phase shift that we so often miss in this story. Initially, it's just a bedroom community. People are sleeping there and leaving for work.
Right.
But eventually, factories moved to Brooklyn. Why? They wanted to be near their workers, and they wanted the cheaper land to build bigger, more modern factories than they could in Manhattan.
So the jobs followed the people.
And then the services followed the jobs. And then apartment buildings started to fill in the gaps between the single-family homes and the factories. And then suddenly, one day you wake up, and Brooklyn isn't a suburb anymore. It is urbanized. It's become a city in its own right with its own gravitational pull.
So the suburb of today is, in some cases, the city of tomorrow.
In the American model, that is the organic growth cycle, yes. Farm to commuter town to edge city to full-blown metropolis.
Okay, so that's the American model. Organic, technology-driven expansion, pulling people outward. But the source material throws this massive curveball when we look at Eastern Europe. It talks about something called under-urbanization. I had to read this section twice because it seemed to completely contradict everything we just said about Brooklyn's growth.
It's a fascinating inversion of the model. It really is. You have to remember, in the mid-20th century, while the U.S. was busy building highways and shopping malls, Eastern Europe was under socialist regimes. And socialism treats cities very, very differently than capitalism does.
How so? I mean, at the end of the day, people still need places to live, right?
Of course. But in a market economy, developers build where people want to buy. In a command economy, the state decides where people live and, more importantly, where investment goes. And the number one socialist goal was rapid industrialization. They wanted to build things.
Factories, steel mills, power plants, big, heavy industry.
Exactly. And they often built these massive industrial complexes on the outskirts of existing cities or sometimes just out in the middle of rural areas.
Okay, so if the jobs are on the outskirts, wouldn't the people just naturally move to the outskirts? That's what happened in Brooklyn when the factories moved in?
You would think so. It's the logical conclusion. But the state didn't have the money, or frankly, the political priority, to build housing fast enough to keep up with the factory jobs.
They invested in the machines, not the bedrooms.
Perfectly put. Plus, you had strict political controls on migration. They often restricted people from moving into the major cities to prevent what they saw as overcrowding and social instability.
So you had this really bizarre situation where rural populations were commuting into these new industrial zones, but they weren't allowed to actually move there and live there.
Right, where it was very difficult. So they stayed in their villages. They remained rural on paper, even though they were working industrial jobs. So the urbanization, the growth of cities, lagged way behind the industrialization. That is, under-urbanization.
That explains the socialist era. But then everything changes. The Iron Curtain falls, the barriers vanish, the 1990s arrive.
And the pressure cooker that's been building for 50 years just explodes. This is what the research calls the post-socialist boom. And if you think American sprawl is chaotic, this was on a completely different level.
The sources use words like informal and wild and chaotic.
It was the Wild West of development. Suddenly, the state completely withdraws. They aren't providing housing anymore.
Right.
But there's also no functional mortgage market.
Right.
You can't just walk into a bank in, say, 1991 Albania and get a 30-year fixed-rate loan with 5% down.
Yeah.
That entire financial infrastructure just did not exist yet.
So if you need a house and the government won't give you one and the bank won't lend you any money, what on earth do?
You build it yourself.
Literally.
Literally. We saw this phenomenon of self-provision just skyrocket. People would just go to the edge of town, find a plot of land. Sometimes it was agricultural land that they owned. Sometimes it was public land that they just occupied. And they started laying bricks.
With no permits, no zoning laws, no inspections.
Often, yes. The sources mention Tirana, the capital of Albania, as a prime example. The city essentially doubled in physical size during the 90s, and a huge chunk of that growth was this informal, owner-built sprawl. It wasn't a developer with a blueprint drawing pretty lines on a map. It was thousands of individual families, desperate for housing, taking matters into their own hands.
That is such a stark contrast to the American veteran buying a pre-packaged cookie-cutter home in a cul-de-sac.
In a completely different world.
It really highlights that suburbanization isn't one single thing. It's a process that adapts to the local political economic reality.
It's a shapeshifter.
Absolutely.
In the U.S., it was driven by wealth and deliberate policy. In post-socialist Eastern Europe, it was driven by survival and the total collapse of policy. But the physical result is strangely similar. The city spreads out.
Okay, so that brings us perfectly to the drivers of the spread. We've touched on the history, but I want to get deeper into the mechanics. What actually pushes and pulls people to the edge of the city? We mentioned the steam ferry, so obviously transportation is huge.
Transportation is destiny. I cannot stress this enough. The type of transport a society prioritizes dictates the entire shape of its suburbs.
And the research really splits this into two main models, right? You have the car model and the rail model.
Right. The car model is what we see in the United States, in Canada, Australia, much of the Middle East. If you build massive highways as your primary infrastructure, you're basically inviting low-density sprawl.
Why is that link so direct?
Because a car allows you to cover vast distances relatively quickly, but it also demands a huge amount of space. You need space for multiple lanes, space for exits and on-ramps, and most of all, space for parking at both ends of the trip. So everything naturally spreads out to accommodate the machine.
Versus the rail model, which we see in places like Japan or parts of Europe.
Exactly. Take a city like Tokyo. It has massive suburbs, millions and millions of people commuting every day. But the vast majority of them are commuting by train.
So what does that do to the shape of the city?
It creates density. The suburbs are clustered tightly around the train stations. You get these pockets of high-density housing, shops, and offices right at the station, and then the density drops off as you get further away. It's like a string of pearls along the rail line, whereas the American car model is more like a spilled bucket of paint.
A spilled bucket of paint. That is a very evocative and slightly terrifying image.
But let's talk about the money, the push factors.
Yeah.
Why do people leave this city in the first place? Is it really just that they want a yard for the dog?
The yard is nice, but usually it's about the wallet. The housing market is the primary engine. Rising costs in the city centers push people out. It's simple supply and demand. There's limited space in the core, so prices go up.
And there is a phrase from the U.S. real estate market that the source material mentions, which I think just perfectly captures this entire dynamic. Drive until you qualify.
It's a brutal phrase, isn't it? But it's the absolute reality for millions of people.
Can you walk us through what that actually means for a potential home buyer? What does that process look like? So imagine you are a young couple. You both work in the city. You've saved up a down payment. You want to buy a house. You start by looking at the prices in the city center.
Which are, of course, way out of budget.
Completely unaffordable. So you get in your car and you drive 20 minutes out. You check the prices in that first ring of suburbs. Still too high. So you drive 40 minutes out. Okay, maybe getting warmer. You drive a full hour out. Finally, you hit a price point where the bank looks at your income and says, okay, based on your salary, you qualify for a loan here.
So the commute isn't really a lifestyle choice for many people. It's a financial necessity. You are literally trading your time 2-3 hours a day in a car for the ability to own a roof over your head.
Precisely.
Yeah.
You are monetizing your free time and your well-being to pay for your mortgage. And we have to be clear, government policy plays a huge role in this. In North America, we prioritize roadway investments above all else. We made it easy to drive that hour. We subsidized gasoline for decades. We built the interstate freeway system. And crucially, we zoned the land in these outlying areas so you couldn't build dense apartments, only single-family homes.
So we basically designed the entire system to force people to drive until they qualify.
We greased the skids for sprawl. Yes. We made it to the path of least resistance. Now, compare that to many places in Europe or East Asia, where they often have policies like green belts.
These are the protected natural zones around a city, right? Where
Yeah.
you can't build.
Exactly. London is the most famous example. There is a literal ring around the city where you simply cannot build new developments. It forces development to either go back inward and be more dense, or to leapfrog over the belt entirely to plan satellite cities. It puts a hard cap on the stilt paint.
There's one more driver we have to mention, and it's one that I think people don't think about nearly enough. We always think of suburbs as where people live, but the jobs move too.
They absolutely did. This is such a critical point. It wasn't just people fleeing the city. Industry fled too. Think about the logistics of the modern world. If you are running an Amazon distribution center or a car factory or a massive data center, do you want to be in the middle of a congested city center with narrow one-way streets and no parking for trucks?
No way! It's a nightmare. You want to be right next to a highway exit with acres of land.
Exactly. Modern logistics demand space and speed. Trucks need to be able to get in and out quickly, so warehouses and factories move to the periphery to reduce their transportation and land costs. And of course, once the jobs move to the suburbs, the workers have even more of an incentive to move there to be closer to work.
It's a feedback loop.
A powerful one. And then, of course, you get the 21st century curveball that changed everything again.
Yeah.
Telecommuting.
Right.
The rise of broadband internet and then the COVID-19 pandemic just massively accelerated this trend. If you only have to go into the office 1 or 2 days a week, maybe you don't mind driving an hour and a half on those days.
It effectively stretches the tether. The leash gets longer. You can drive even further until you qualify because you don't have to make that grueling drive every single day.
Which means the sprawl can go even deeper into rural areas than ever before. It creates these so-called Zoom towns in places that used to be just for vacation.
Which brings us to a massive looming problem that's been hiding in plain sight this whole time. We've built all this sprawl, we've driven until we qualified, we've paved the farmland, But who pays to maintain all of those roads and pipes and sewers forever?
Ah, yes, the bill always comes due.
This is Section 3 in our research, The Economics of Sprawl. And there's a number here that genuinely made my jaw drop when I read it.
I think I know the one you mean. It's a big one.
The infrastructure deficit. The research we're looking at cites a projection that between 2005 and 2030, just the cost of maintaining water, sewer, and roads for new sprawl in the U.S. alone could cost the government $1.12 trillion.
It's a staggering number, $1.12 trillion with a T.
That is an almost incomprehensible amount of money. How do we even get that deep in the hole? How is that possible?
To understand that number, you have to understand what some economists and urban planners call the maintenance trap. Or if you want to be a little more provocative about it, the Ponzi scheme of asphalt.
Whoa. Okay, a Ponzi scheme. That's a strong word. That implies fraud, or at the very least, an inevitable collapse. Walk me through that logic.
Okay, think about how a new suburb is typically built. A developer comes to a small town council and says, I want to buy that big farm on the edge of town and turn it into 500 beautiful new homes.
And the town council sees dollar signs, they see 500 new families paying property taxes, they see fees for building permits. It looks like a huge immediate influx of cash.
A windfall.
Yeah.
And usually the developer pays to put in the initial roads and pipes as part of the deal, right?
Right. They build the infrastructure for their subdivision.
Exactly. So for the city, that brand new road is essentially free, and it has a warranty. For the first, say, 20 years, that road cost the city almost nothing to maintain. It's just pure profit coming in from the new tax revenue.
Feels like free money. A no-brainer.
It's the sugar high of growth. But, and this is the big but, asphalt doesn't last forever. Pipes don't last forever. Fast forward 25 or 30 years.
The road starts to crack. The water mains start to break. The pumps in the sewer station fail.
And suddenly, the city is on the hook to replace all of it. But here's a fair math problem. And it's a deadly one for municipal budgets.
Okay.
In a low-density suburb, you might only have, say, 10 or 20 houses on a specific mile of road. Those 20 households are paying property taxes every year. But is the total tax collected from those 20 houses over 30 years enough to pay for a $1 million road replacement project?
I'm guessing the answer is a resounding no.
The answer is almost always no. Not even close. Now contrast that with a dense city block. You might have 500 households and several businesses paying taxes on that same mile of pipe. They can afford the maintenance. The suburb can't. The tax revenue generated per mile of infrastructure is just too low.
So when the 30-year bill comes due, the city doesn't have the cash set aside.
Right. So what do? They can't just raise property taxes by 500%. The residents would revolt and vote them out of office. So they approve another new development even further out on the edge of town.
They use the sugar high from the new development to pay for the old development's crumbling roads.
Exactly. They use the permit fees and the initial cash influx from the new subdivision to patch the holes in the old subdivision. They have to keep growing forever just to stay solvent.
That is literally the definition of a Ponzi scheme. You need a constant stream of new investors to pay off the old ones.
That is the growth Ponzi scheme. And eventually, you either run out of land to develop or the growth slows down for economic reasons. And when the music stops, you are left with billions and billions of dollars in unfunded maintenance liabilities. That is where that $1.12 trillion number comes from.
That is genuinely terrifying. It's like finding out your entire house is built on a giant sinkhole, but the sinkhole is financial and it's 30 years wide.
It explains why so many American municipalities are constantly, perpetually broke. Despite looking wealthy and prosperous on the surface, they are drowning in these long-term liabilities they can never hope to pay off.
And this economic pressure also fundamentally changes the commercial landscape, right? We aren't just seeing houses spread out. We're seeing these things called edge cities pop up.
Right. Because the central city is often broke or congested, developers start building these massive, self-contained clusters of office buildings and shopping malls way out in the suburbs. Look at a place like Tyson's Corner in Virginia, outside D.C., or Century City in Los Angeles. These are edge cities. They're these strange, high-density dots in an otherwise low-density map.
And this ties directly into the brownfield versus greenfield debate that the research brings up.
This is a huge issue for sustainability and smart growth. A brownfield is a piece of land in the city that was previously used for industrial purposes. Maybe it was an old factory or a contaminated warehouse lot. It's often ugly, it might be polluted, and it's expensive to clean up and redevelop.
But it's already connected to the existing roads and pipes and transit.
It is. The infrastructure is already there.
Right.
But developers, for obvious reasons, much prefer Greenfields. This is fresh, untouched farmland or forest on the edge of town. It's cheap, it's clean, there are no demolition costs, and often the suburban taxes are much lower.
So all of the financial incentives are stacked to encourage expanding outward, eating up more nature, rather than recycling and fixing the land we already have.
Yes, and suburban municipalities will often offer massive tax breaks to attract industry to their greenfields. You have places like the City of Industry in California, which was incorporated basically just to be a tax haven for businesses. They desperately want those commercial taxes to help pay for the residential infrastructure deficit we just talked about. It's a really vicious cycle.
Okay, now, we absolutely cannot talk about the history of suburbanization, especially in the U.S., without talking about race. It is foundational to how and why the suburbs were built the way they were.
It is.
Section 4 in our research covers race, inequality, and demographics. And this isn't just uncomfortable history, it's structural history that has echoes to this day.
You cannot separate the American suburb from the history of racial segregation. It's impossible. We often use the term white flight to describe what happened in the 1950s and 60s.
And I think sometimes people hear that phrase, white flight, and they imagine it was just a series of millions of individual choices, like white families just happened to decide to move all at the same time.
That's the sanitized version of the story. The reality is that it was heavily engineered by government policy. We talked about the GI Bill earlier, that great engine of middle-class wealth. Well, it was largely administered by local states and banks. And in many places, Black veterans were systematically denied those benefits. They were shut out.
And then on top of that, you had the official policy of redlining.
The Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, literally drew red lines on maps around Black and integrated neighborhoods and told banks, do not insure loans here. These are high risk. Meanwhile, they were actively subsidizing and insuring the loans for the brand new, all-white suburbs. So you had a government-backed system that was helping white families build generational equity in the suburbs while simultaneously locking Black families out of that same wealth accumulation.
And what was the economic effect on the cities that those families were left in?
Absolutely devastating. As white households left taking their tax dollars with them, the cities faced a catastrophic revenue crisis. Services were cut, schools declined, infrastructure crumbled, and housing prices in those redlined or transitioning neighborhoods fell.
So it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The city became worse because the money left, which then justified more people leaving.
Exactly. It created the stereotype of the dangerous, decaying inner city that dominated the news and media in the late 20th century. But, and this is a really important update to the narrative, that was the 20th century story. The 21st century story is starting to shift.
Right. The sources are very clear on this point. The suburbs are no longer monolithic. If you drive through a typical American suburb today, it does not look like the set of a 1950s sitcom.
Not at all. Since the late 90s, U.S. suburbs have become increasingly and rapidly diverse. You now have significant African American, Asian American, and Latino populations moving to suburbs, often for the same reasons white families did generations ago: better schools, more space, a perception of safety. The white picket fence is being painted in many different colors now.
The text uses this really interesting term, suburban immigrant gateways.
This is a global phenomenon, not just an American one. In many places around the world now, when new immigrants arrive, they don't go to the traditional Little Italy or Chinatown in the dense city center anymore. They go straight to the suburbs.
Why is that? What's the pull?
It's where the jobs are now. We talked about the factories and warehouses moving out to the periphery. If the Amazon Logistics Center is in a suburb 30 miles outside of town, the immigrant workforce moves to that suburb to be close to work. It's that simple.
But this new diversity plays out very differently in other parts of the world. In Europe, the word suburb often has a totally different, almost opposite connotation.
Oh, massively different. It's an inversion. In Paris, for example, the banlieues, the suburbs, are often where the massive high-rise public housing projects are. That is where the marginalized populations, the immigrant communities, and ethnic minorities tend to live. The wealthy and elite live in the historic center of Paris. It's the complete inverse of the traditional American model.
So in the U.S., for decades, inner city was often used as a code word for poor and minority. In Paris, suburb is the code word.
Broadly speaking, yes. The periphery, the edge, is the zone of social and economic exclusion. And if you want to see the most stark contrast of all, you have to look at the global south.
The mix of formal and informal development side by side.
You see this in Brazil, in South Africa, in India. You will literally have a gated, high-security, middle-class suburban development with private security guards, swimming pools, and manicured lawns. And right next to its wall, sometimes literally leaning against it,
Oh.
you have an informal settlement, a shantytown, with no running water or electricity.
It's inequality made physical, a literal wall between two worlds.
It is. It's a visual representation of completely uneven infrastructure planning. One side has clean water and reliable power. The other side often has to steal it from the grid. But they're both technically part of the same suburban expansion.
That is a very heavy reality, and it segues perfectly into the human cost of all this. Because we move to the suburbs for a better life, right? That's the promise: fresh air, safety, happiness. But Section 5 of our research suggests that might be the biggest myth of all.
The happiness myth. It's a fascinating and deeply counterintuitive part of this story.
Tell me about this 1974 study that the sources mentioned, because if we've known this for almost 50 years, I feel like we've been actively ignoring the results.
So back in 1974, a group of researchers decided to actually test the core hypothesis. Do people who live in the suburbs feel better? Are they measurably happier than people who live in the city?
And what did they find?
They found nothing. No statistically significant difference whatsoever. Suburbanites reported neither greater satisfaction with their neighborhood nor a better overall quality of life when compared to urban dwellers.
That seems absolutely wild to me. If I have a yard and a big house and quiet streets, shouldn't I be happier than the guy living in a cramped apartment hearing sirens all night long?
You would think so.
Hmm.
That's the trade-off we all assume we're making. But you have to factor in what you lose in that trade, and what you lose is connection. It's what the research calls the isolation factor.
Because sprawl separates everything.
It separates everything into its own little pod. Your home is here. Your work is a 45-minute drive over there. The grocery store is 5 miles that way. Your friends are 10 miles in the other direction.
So every single human interaction requires a plan and a car ride.
Exactly. There is no bumping into people at the corner store. There's no serendipity. And if you cannot drive, you are effectively under house arrest.
This hits two groups the hardest: the elderly and the young.
Let's talk about the seniors first. The sources use this clinical-sounding term, driving cessation. It's a very clinical term for what is often a heartbreaking reality. When an older person living in the suburbs loses their eyesight or their reflexes and has to stop driving for safety reasons, their social life effectively ends overnight.
Because there's no bus. They can't walk to the coffee shop or the library.
They become prisoners in their own homes, completely dependent on others for everything. This leads to sharp, profound social isolation, which we now know from medical research is a huge health risk for seniors.
It's as dangerous as smoking a pack of cigarettes a day.
That's the comparison, yes. Loneliness kills. And our suburbs, by their very design, are machines for creating loneliness if you don't have a set of car keys.
And what about for kids? I mean, I have these fond memories of riding my bike in the cul-de-sac, but the sources paint a much darker picture of what they call limited independent mobility.
Think about it from a kid's perspective. Can a 12-year-old in a typical suburb walk to a movie theater? Can they walk to a comic book shop or a friend's house in another subdivision?
Usually, no. They'd have to cross a 6-lane road.
Right. They are effectively trapped in their subdivision until a parent can drive them somewhere. It's the origin of the soccer mom phenomenon. Parents become unpaid full-time taxi drivers.
And the kids just become cargo being ferried from one scheduled activity to another.
Exactly. And the research shows that adolescents, teenagers report feeling incredibly isolated, bored, and frustrated by this. They have the desire for autonomy, but they have zero mobility to act on it.
And that boredom. Well, that leads us directly to the drug abuse paradox. This was honestly the most shocking part of the entire body of research for me. I, like many people, grew up thinking that drug abuse was an inner-city problem. That's what the news and TV shows always showed us.
That is the persistent media stereotype. But the actual data tells a very, very different story. The New England study of suburban youth, this was a major long-term piece of research, specifically looked at upper-middle-class suburban kids.
So these are wealthy kids. Good schools, safe streets, all the advantages.
The ones who should have all. And they found that these kids displayed increased rates of drug and alcohol use compared to the national average.
Wait, higher than the national average?
Yes, and in some key metrics, specifically for things like binge drinking and misuse of prescription drugs, they showed higher rates of substance abuse than their inner-city counterparts.
Why? That's so counterintuitive. If they have the money and the good life, what is possibly driving that?
The researchers point to a toxic cocktail of factors. First, The profound boredom and isolation we just discussed. If you're a teenager stuck in a subdivision with nothing to do and no way to get anywhere, you create your own entertainment. Second, you have disposable income. These kids have the money to buy drugs.
And the parents are often away working long hours to pay for that big house and the 2 cars.
That's part of it, yes. You have latchkey kids in these big empty houses. But there's also this immense crushing pressure to succeed in these enclosed social and economic enclaves. The anxiety levels are through the roof.
And the sources mention a very specific and terrifying rise in heroin and opioid use in these communities.
Yes. In the 2000s, there was a documented spike in the incidence of heroin use among young white suburban men and women. But here is the real kicker, what the research calls the treatment disparity.
This is about how doctors perceive the problem, right?
It's a diagnostic blind spot. A doctor in an emergency room sees a clean-cut kid from a wealthy zip code, maybe a high school athlete, who comes in with certain symptoms. The doctor's mental model does not immediately jump to heroin addiction. It just doesn't fit their stereotype.
So they might miss the diagnosis or at least delay it.
They miss it or they delay it. They look for other explanations first. Whereas if a kid from a poor urban neighborhood walks in with the exact same symptoms, the doctor might suspect drug use immediately. The perceived safety and wholesomeness of the suburbs actually masks the danger until it's often much further along and harder to treat.
That is just tragic. It's the white picket fence literally hiding the crisis happening inside the house.
Exactly. It's the danger of believing the idyllic image instead of looking at the complex reality.
Wow. Okay. We have covered a huge amount of ground here. History, economics, race, psychology. We have to touch on our final section, section 6, the environment. And I think most of us know the headlines here, cars are bad for the climate, but let's dig just a bit deeper than that.
The carbon footprint of sprawl is massive, and you're right, it's not just about the tailpipe emissions from cars, although that's a huge part of it. It really comes down to 3 main things: commuting, land consumption, and direct energy use.
Commuting is the obvious one. More miles driven equals more CO2 in the atmosphere. Simple.
Right. But let's look at land consumption. When you build at a very low density, you're physically eating up more of the natural landscape. You're replacing forests and wetlands, which are crucial carbon sinks and help manage floodwaters, with impermeable surfaces like asphalt and chemically treated lawns.
And the lawns themselves are a unique environmental problem.
The American lawn is an ecological disaster. It's a monoculture, usually of non-native grass. It provides zero habitat for native pollinators like bees and butterflies. And we dump massive amounts of fresh water, chemical fertilizers, and pesticides on them, just to keep them that unnatural shade of green.
We are essentially farming millions of acres of a crop that nobody eats.
That is a perfect way to put it. And then there's the energy use of the houses themselves. A detached single-family suburban house has 4 walls and a roof completely exposed to the elements. It takes a huge amount of energy to heat in the winter and cool in the summer.
Compared to an apartment.
Compared to an apartment or a townhouse in the city, which shares walls with its neighbors. That shared thermal mass makes it much, much more energy efficient.
So we have painted a pretty complex and, frankly, a pretty challenging picture here. It's not just desperate housewives, and it's not just a boring commute. It's a massive global engine with some very real, very high costs.
Let's try to synthesize all of this. The research shows that suburbanization is a progressive process, meaning it moves forward, it's driven by fundamental forces like population growth and technology, but it comes with an incredibly high price tag.
A price we're all paying.
Financially, we have the infrastructure deficit, that Ponzi scheme of asphalt we talked about. Socially, we have rising rates of isolation and related mental health crises. And environmentally, we have the massive carbon footprint.
And it adapts. It looks different in post-socialist Europe than it does in Southern California, but that fundamental drive is the same.
The underlying drive, the search for more space, the reaction against the perceived problems of the city center, that seems to be a universal human impulse. But we're clearly reaching a tipping point where the hidden costs might be starting to outweigh the perceived benefits.
Before we sign off, I want to leave our listeners with that final provocative thought you mentioned when we were prepping. It connects that drive until you qualify idea with the aging in place problem. It's kind of a haunting question, really.
It's the question that I think urban planners are losing sleep over right now more than any other. Think about it. We built this entire suburban landscape for one very specific type of user.
The nuclear family with a car.
The nuclear family with a car. That was the design specification. Mom, Dad, 2 kids, and a station wagon in the garage.
But the demographics of our society are shifting dramatically. The baby boomers are all entering retirement. The birth rate is dropping.
Exactly. The kids grow up and they leave. The parents are staying behind. But as those parents age into their 70s and 80s, many of them can no longer drive safely. And they find themselves living alone in these massive houses that require a ton of maintenance in neighborhoods where you literally need a car to buy a gallon of milk.
So what happens to the entire suburban experiment when the people inside it can no longer operate the machinery, the automobile that is required to live there?
That is the trillion-dollar question. Are we, without realizing it, building the slums of the future? If the tax base collapses because the working-age people have moved on, and the infrastructure crumbles because of that maintenance deficit, and the remaining residents are isolated seniors who are trapped in their homes, what does that neighborhood look like in 20 or 30 years?
Are the cul-de-sacs of today the ghost towns of tomorrow?
It's a very real possibility. Unless we get very serious, very quickly about rethinking how we retrofit these places, unless we figure out how to bring some of the city back to the suburb, more public transit, more walkability, more small-scale commercial, more housing diversity.
So the solution might be to make the suburbs a little less suburban.
Precisely. We need to close the loop on that cycle we saw in Brooklyn.
A huge thank you to you, our listener, for joining us on this deep dive. I hope you'll never look at a strip mall or a winding subdivision street the same way again.
Keep questioning the landscape around you. It has a story to tell.
We'll see you next time.